So now let us recap a little bit. In 1924, the Greek Archbishop, in concert with the Patriarch of Constantinople, changed the calendar, the Manaean calendar. That means only the fixed feasts were changed. 1924. And the rest of Orthodoxy did not follow. Eventually, others did follow, but the great number of Orthodox churches and people remained in the old calendar. When that happened in Greece, 1 to 2 million people rejected it, along with priests, but no bishops. Then, 11 years later, 1935, 3 bishops left the official church, the New Calendar Church, and took the leadership of these million of people in Greece, which were only served by priests. Their names were Metropolitans Germanos of Demetrias, Chrysostom of Florina, and Chrysostom of Zakynthos. And because they did this, they feared persecution, and within 1 month they ordained 4 other bishops of the priests that were available to them. And granted, they may have not known these men very well, but only by their reputation. The 4 bishops they ordained was another Germanus of the Cyclades, a ruling bishop, Christopher of Megara, a ruling bishop, Polycarp of Diavila, a ruling bishop, and Matthew, an auxiliary bishop of the village or town of Bethsina. Now, they made him, by the providence of God, a auxiliary bishop, a bishop that has no authority to ordain anybody. A vicar bishop is one who is under someone else, another bishop. He can do nothing. He is told where to go and what to do, only with permission. He's the only one they ordained, not a complete ruling bishop. And it must have been by the providence of God, because he is the one, the instigator, that made the first schism in the movement. Now, in 1935, when they did this, they made an encyclical. And in an encyclical, some say it wasn't thoroughly thought out. It wasn't a major confession of faith. It was an encyclical, a letter signed by the 3 bishops, saying that we are separating or staying away from the official church because of this deviation. They've changed the Manaean. They haven't changed the Paschalian. But the Paschalian calendar is the movable calendar of the church that determines Pascha and all the movable feasts afterwards. And there are great condemnations against anybody who changes the Paschalian. And councils were brought together. The main ones, they're called pan-Orthodox, although not necessarily pan-Orthodox, because the only Greek archbishops or patriarchs gathered in 1583, in 1587, and 1593, and they condemned the Gregorian calendar, which was specifically the Paschalian and the Manaean of the Pope. The 2 of them were condemned at these so-called pan-Orthodox councils. Now, in 1924, these modernists, Masons, took only half. The Paschalian that had all the condemnations against it, even from the councils, they left alone. But they took the Maniaean and they changed the Maniaean. So it caused a schism. And this is a schism, how should we say, with a small s. Because this schism meant that this church, say in Greece and in Constantinople, they celebrated the Feast of St. George at a different day than all the rest of Orthodoxy. And this small s schism could be rectified if they would go back. And everything else, they remained, they confessed the faith and everything else. So it was just in the calendar that they changed the dates. And this is what Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florina calls a correctable schism, because that's all these people had to do, is to say, acknowledge that they've made a mistake. But who can do this? This is the type of a schism that has that rises up to the point where you have to gather all the church together, a pan-Orthodox council, to condemn the one half of the calendar change. Whereas the previous councils condemned the Paschalian and the Maniaean. Now these supposed wise men, those Masons, thought that they could just change the Maniaean. Because after all, they said, not all the churches celebrate St. Catherine at the same day. They don't celebrate other feasts at the same day. Some people celebrate it now, some people celebrate it later. So they thought that they could avoid the condemnations of the 15th century councils and go ahead and do this. So this caused, of course, a confusion. Well, in 1937, one monk, Father Marcos Haniotis was his last name. He wrote a letter to the head of the synod, Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florina and Metropolitan Germanus of Demetrias, and questioned them, what type of schism is this? Is it a real schism where the grace has departed from them completely, as you said in your encyclical of 1935? They wrote this encyclical to strengthen the people, to warn them to stay away from the New Calendar Church until such time as they work to rectify this situation. And they said that their departure and separation was something they thought was going to be temporary, nothing permanent. Whereas the auxiliary bishop, Matthew, was given the impression to everybody, this is a permanent break. We don't want to go back. We don't want to correct the faults of the new calendars. We want to separate completely. We don't want to bring them to repentance. We want to start our own church. And this is where he separated in his thinking from the rest of his synod. And this is very, very bad. He caused what we call a real schism. So, the bishops wrote back to Father Marcos and explained to him that this is a schism that can be corrected. This did not sit well with Bishop Matthew. And being what he was, a simpleton and a very reactionary, and many say being moved in his actions by the abbess of this big convent that he was living in, overreacted. And all of his actions were just overreaction, one after another. And he wrote an encyclical in 1944 explaining his opinion. And this is quite revealing. At first, when he read the letter of the Metropolitans in 1937, it was finished. He cut off communication. He cut off communion with his bishops and called them the former bishops. It's like he's a pope. The bishops who ordained him are now former bishops. Okay, so he read this letter and he called them the former bishops. And in this epistle that he wrote in 1944, he called them antichrists. And he called them 7 times anathema on them. And he said that he believed in his schism. In his schism, he believes from the moment that they changed, the calendar, the Manaean, they fell away from the church. Everybody who, the moment they changed from the old calendar to the new Manaean, that whoever did that fell away from the church. Then he said, likewise, local churches who can celebrate and praise with those, what he calls innovating churches that change the calendar, they have the same liability. They're outside the church. And then he says, from the outset, the innovating, wrong-believing, quote-unquote, which through schism have been deprived of the grace of the Holy Spirit. They say as soon as they change the calendar, they don't have grace anymore. Well, Metropolitans Chrysostom and Germanus wrote him back and explained to everybody exactly how the Orthodox Church thinks and through history. And quite frankly, they didn't ridicule Bishop Matthew, because as one of his arguments, he said that in the life of St. Paisius, his disciple denied Christ when he was walking on the road, and grace left him, just like that. So from the life of a saint, he extrapolated that improperly, of course, to the life of the church, taking an example from the life of St. Paisius from Egypt. But the fathers wrote back, and they wrote a very beautiful letter, and explained to him that, well, man, don't you know, from 1920 or from the 1924, no patriarch or bishop broke communion with the state church of Greece or the ecumenical patriarch. Despite these observances of the new Manaean, no bishop declared that the state church of Greece or the ecumenical patriarch had apostatized, or that they were outside the grace of God in their mysteries. No one did that. But Matthew, he has the nerve to do it. Metropolitan Chrysostom wrote in his letter, and I'm going to quote these very nice paragraphs. Quote, if in leaving for exile we call the Archbishop of Athens a schismatic and the Church of Greece schismatic, we use the words schism not in the sense in which the Church uses it to indicate a rupture with the Orthodox Church and the consequent estrangement from the grace of Christ and the mysteries, but in the sense that on account of the calendar innovation, the Archbishop of Athens has cut himself and the hierarchs that follow him from the other Orthodox churches with regard to the celebration of the feasts and observances of the fasts. So he's saying he didn't become a Muslim, he didn't become a Roman Catholic, he didn't become a Protestant, he didn't fall into a heresy. He changed the feasts and he changed the calendar which affects the feasts and the fasts. He goes on. This succession by his beatitude and the hierarchs that follow him gives us the right to put forward our personal and wholly individual opinion that his beatitude and the hierarchs who follow him, and we're talking about the new calendars, insofar as they have sundered the unity of the Universal Orthodox Church in the simultaneous celebration of the feasts and the simultaneous observances of the fast, have forfeited divine grace only potentially and not in actuality, abiding under the curse and anathemas which the Holy Fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council hurled against those who violated the traditions and moved the eternal landmarks which our fathers fixed. But his beatitude and the hierarchs who are of like mind with him will only become actually deprived of divine grace and estranged from the Orthodox spirit of the mysteries when they are proclaimed as such and as schismatics in actuality by a pan-Orthodox synod, which alone is entitled to do this according to the statutes of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So he's saying, because these people are potentially schismatic, they can only be condemned as actual schismatics when the church gathers together to adjudicate this question. And this is what exactly Metropolitan Chrysostom was doing. He went to the patriarchates. He traveled out of Greece and went to the patriarchates of Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch, trying to encourage them to come together to make a pan-Orthodox council to judge what the Patriarch Constantinople did and the Archbishop of Athens did. So he was working in the proper vein. So let's not get confused. There is a group nowadays called the Cyprianites, and they are heretics. They are heretics because they espouse ecumenism, in that they give Holy Communion to the new calendars, who are now ecumenists. Back then, in the time of Metropolitan Chrysostom, they were not ecumenists. And they say the same thing that Metropolitan Chrysostom, but their application of it doesn't apply to heretics. Heretics, it's obvious when if they deny the creed, you're cut off from the church. And if they fall under anathema, they're outside the church. The ecumenists have been condemned. But Cyprian says the same thing that Metropolitan Chrysostom here says, but only applies it. He applies it to the ecumenists, which cannot be done. Metropolitan Chrysostom applied it to schismatics that have not been condemned. Cyprian applies it to heretics that have been condemned. And he says the same things. Well, we can't judge them. They're already judged. He says we can't judge them unless a pan-Orthodox council comes together to judge the ecumenists. So he's being very, very deceitful, this Cyprian. But now, back in Cyprian is in this century. What happened with the change of calendar happened, of course, in 1924, and it caused a schism. And Metropolitan Chrysostom says we have to wait for a council to come together and condemn these people if they judge them damnable. Now, Matthew cuts himself off from his synod and calls them former bishops and antichrists, and he just tears them apart. How many canons does Matthew fall under for doing such a thing? It's impossible for a bishop to do what he has done. And there are a number of canons that say that this man should be deposed. And I could enumerate them all, but they're on our website. And you could go over them, and we could read them all, but no bishop can secede from his synod and judge them and condemn them for no reason. And what did they do? Did they change their faith? No. What did they do? Are they the same calendar as he is? Yes, because Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florina never accepted the new Mannaean. Even from 1924 to 1935, he never accepted it. So he has no reason to condemn them, but he condemns them. Matthew does. And so, this is his first error. And I may say that if the bishops saw what would follow, I think if they knew what would follow, they would have gathered together and condemned Matthew for breaking so many canons of the church and condemning his own hierarchs for no reason. And they should have deposed him. And if they did that, if punishment came down upon him as it should have, perhaps all the subsequent schisms in the Greek church would have been tempered, knowing that punishment was severe. It should be severe if anybody broke the canons like this. And one other thing, of course, Bishop Matthew was a simpleton. That's an easy way to put it. But he did not know church history. And he did not know that in the history of the church, even complete churches in countries did not celebrate Pascha on the same day because of certain irregularities. But these churches were never condemned. And who were the Church of England, the church in Spain, the church in Gaul, at times did not celebrate Pascha as the rest of the Orthodox Church did. But they were not condemned. They were brought about to calculate everything properly. And that was with the Paschalian, which had a condemnation on it that if anybody deliberately celebrated that improperly, that there was punishment due to them. But now we're talking about the Mannaean, something very, very doesn't come up to the level of Pascha. It's the Mannaean. It's not the Paschalian. So he did not know this, and yet he goes ahead and condemns someone for changing the Mannaean.